Hi there, it's Donovan. Oh wait, hold on. Can we get a little visual enhance really quick?
Ah, that's much better. Today at One Last Game, the Tonight Show that doesn't even try to be tonight and could probably film that night, but we're just really lazy. Today I wanted to talk about how Nintendo always seems to be looking out for, you could say, the little guy. Over the course of possibly a decade, Nintendo's been heavily investing in indie collaborations and just involving themselves in the indie community ever since the Wii U era. I mean, like, that's pretty self-explanatory. What even is a Wii U? I mean, people had to wait long times, maybe months, possibly years, only to get like Star Fox Zero or goddamn Game & Wario. The game droughts of the Wii U era were pretty bad, and even though the 3DS was faring a little bit better, still game droughts were a constant, mainly because, they were building up and saving their library for the inevitable Nintendo Switch. So, to bury the Wii U deep down in the grave, just to beat it down a dead horse even more, they kind of sacrificed some games for the Switch instead of the Wii U. And some games were left to rot on the Wii U. Sorry to you Nintendo Land fans. But in order to sort of satiate Wii U owners and even Nintendo 3DS owners, Nintendo invested heavily into indie collaborations. Now, indies, they were a big part of Nintendo's release schedule, and Nintendo almost borderline treated indies like their own, and it heavily helped out not just the indie developers, but Nintendo in general, especially during that generation. For example, they invested heavily into promoting what may be the face of indies, Shovel Knight. Now, when I was a kid, I even believed Shovel Knight was a Nintendo IP. I mean, it was heavily promoted. I believe it was published by Nintendo. I remember it releasing on the Nintendo 3DS, and my brother and I really wanted this game for some reason. It just looked so cool. And, even this right here, what I'm holding right now, is a great embodiment of Nintendo's dedication to indies. A Shovel Knight made amiibo. Yes, it may be of a different quality, you could say, compared to official Nintendo amiibos, but the fact that this exists alone shows their great dedication to indie developers, and I believe there's like 3 more Shovel Knight amiibos, which is crazy to think about. But Shovel Knight was really a huge turning point for Nintendo and indies, and it really showed how much Nintendo truly cared, and also that Nintendo was truly desperate. Alone, Shovel Knight obviously would have been successful mainly because, well, it's a great game, but Nintendo really helped give that game some legs and really promoted it as its own. And something that a lot of indie developers have said about Nintendo is that they really treat them like they really care, like they're their own creations. They give indie developers utmost respect and even give them huge spotlights. Nintendo does a whole lot, and obviously that was primarily because, well, Nintendo didn't have a whole lot, and Nintendo is not the most consumer-friendly, you could say, but they're very, say, developer-focused. They believe that Nintendo gives them a lot of spotlight, and that even extended to what they eventually called them, Nindies. They gave indies their own Nintendo spotlight, and this was especially clear during the very first years of the Nintendo Switch. Back then, when Nintendo Switch software was still reliant on first-party stuff, and third parties were still holding out, seeing if it was another Wii U situation. But what picked up the slack again, just like the Wii U, was the indie developers. Nintendo called them Nindies and heavily featured them in their E3 presentations and Nintendo Directs, and it gave the Switch a really big identity. Indie developers have even expressed how much better the development tools are on Nintendo Switch compared to like the Wii U or even like Xbox. Microsoft, the developers of Windows, they say Nintendo Switch is a very easy console to develop for, primarily because, well, I mean, honestly, it's just, a really weak Android tablet. So, well, indie games, most of the time, they're smaller developers. They won't be utilizing such humongous assets with, hyper detailed graphics that only AAA developers seem to love. They're usually on the smaller, but with limits comes creativity, and they were able to push their creativity to the limits and deliver breathtaking games. The Nintendo eShop has been a massive home for indie developers. Nintendo has definitely relaxed their quality standards, maybe a little too much, but they are allowed so many indie games to be released on the Nintendo eShop, and they found a great home there. And honestly, the Nintendo Switch is just a great place for indies to be, with its just pick up and play nature. It's smaller, bite-sized games on the go. That's perfect. That's kind of what mobile gaming is, although indie games are definitely up on a higher tier than mobile games, and you can just bring that anywhere. And co-op play, Nintendo Switch is the console, in my opinion, for co-op play. Not only do you get tons of games that offer co-op, but just the ideal nature of the Nintendo Switch itself enables co-op, especially with the Joy-Cons. Slide them up and hand one to a friend, and you're just off to the races, or off playing co-op games like It Takes Two, offering those bite-sized experiences on the go with friends, anytime, anywhere. That's really awesome. And going back to more recently, Nintendo dropped the Nindies name and reformatted how they showcased indie games into indie worlds. Full presentations, much like Nintendo Directs, but focused on indie games. That is something that they do consistently every year. Something that Microsoft, PlayStation don't even do that much. Nintendo offers a huge spotlight on indie games, just like Nintendo Directs. They treat them on the same level, and they offer the utmost respect to these indie games, and they give humongous promotions to these indie games as well. I remember Snipperclips was actually an indie game made by an indie developer. Nintendo stepped in and offered some assistance, some financial stuff, and offered to publish the game. And that game, it's a pretty fun co-op game that was offered at the launch of the Switch. That was really awesome. Hollow Knight, yes, it was released on PC before Nintendo Switch, but Nintendo did a lot of promotion for Hollow Knight, and they kind of treated it again as their own game. And Nintendo fans, they can't think for themselves, so anything endorsed by the big N, they will pick up. But that promotion alone boosted Hollow Knight's popularity by a lot. And yes, it was already successful on PC, but the way Nintendo was promoting it, it might as well have been like a new actual Metroid game. Its success cannot be derived only from Nintendo. The game itself is fantastic, but Nintendo did have a playing hand in giving Hollow Knight a even bigger platform.
Hello, hi. It is Editor Don here, always filling in for DonovanDud whenever he forgets something, and he very much forgot to mention, the biggest Nintendo collaboration with indies being Cadence of Hyrule, Crypt of the Necrodancer, where Nintendo allowed an indie developer to handle one of their most prolific IPs ever, and just, is a fun collaboration that you just don't get to see often, and hopefully Nintendo will continue to do that in the future.
Yo, this is DonovanDud, filling in for Editor Don, and always mentioning the cool things Donovan might have forgotten. And one thing he probably forgot to mention was Undertale being a big deal when it released on Switch, and it was even featured in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate with Sans being featured as a Mii costume fighter. That's always great to see, and there's other indie representation in Smash Bros. They truly do belong in such a fighting game. Smash Bros. Is just a huge event for all things gaming, and the indie involvement there is great. And going back to Undertale being on a Nintendo system, and also Deltarune, them being there is just the perfect match. The Undertale and Deltarune have such huge influences from the Earthbound trilogy, and it is perfect to see a home on Nintendo Switch and Switch 2.
And all in all, Nintendo truly does care and need indies, and obviously Nintendo has done a lot better with their third-party support, but that doesn't mean they throw away indies like they're trash and they don't need them anymore. In fact, they need them more than ever, because A game is a game. More games, the more the merrier, really. And the way indies have been thriving on Nintendo Switch, and now even Nintendo Switch 2, is amazing. The Nintendo Switch library wouldn't be the same without their indie developers, and Nintendo has done a lot for that community, and hopefully will continue doing even more with indie worlds. And they're even promoting indie games in their big Nintendo Switch 2 events. I mean, Silksong will be playable at a Nintendo Switch 2 event. They're treating it as like a giant AAA developer, and that's always great to see. Nintendo giving platforms to these smaller creators, and making them a vital component to their success. And it's something admirable from that that very controversial company, you could say. Nintendo is not the worst, but they can be better. I remember an interview from Mr. Imura, who was the chief architect of the NES and Super NES and all those different consoles. He equated Nintendo's relationship to indies by saying, Nintendo is kind of like an indie developer, whereas so many game companies, like, say, I don't know, PlayStation, where they're like, all right, make 12 live service games. Oops. Maybe the Nintendo's developer roots, how they're so focused on, the game dev and their idea, that kind of resonated with a lot of indie developers. Nintendo is more focused on the individual idea one person can make, and they focus an entire game around that idea. And he kind of equated that to indie developers, how it all spawns from one person's idea and dream, and they make it into a reality. And he equated what the hell? Nintendi? That's a new term Nintendo could use. I'm copywriting that. That's it from One Last Game, and the show will not end until One Last Game. And I want to know your thoughts. Comment down what indie games you love to play on Nintendo Switch. One of my personal favorites was Cuphead. Maybe that was promoted more so by Microsoft, which is an example of Xbox doing what Nintendo does. But Cuphead was brought to the Switch, and I feel like that's the perfect platform for Cuphead. Take that experience, that co-op experience, anywhere, whether on the TV where you're screaming at each other, or on the go and being a public nuisance in the train and playing in tabletop mode, handing a Joy-Con to a friend, and screaming profusely at all the stupid fucking bosses. I hate the dice boss! And I have a confession to make. I have still not beaten Hollow Knight years later. I have played that game for like 7 years and I still have not beat it. And I better get to that right now. Can you size me up really quick?
Hello? Oh, this is awkward.